Good morning. Welcome to our session this morning on Formation for Life. I have the very happy privilege of introducing two friends of mine, and actually friends of each other, in Margaret Monahan Hogan, who is presently at the University of Portland, where she is the McNerney Hansen Professor of Ethics and holds a chair and is director of a center there. And also Laura Garcia of Boston College. A conspiracy among them dictates that they reverse the order of presentation given on the program, and therefore Margaret Hogan will speak first on the limits of embryonic obligation.
Thanks. Thank you. It's always good to be here, and it's always good to see so many students here. Laura and I frequently prepare our work for the students here at Notre Dame because we think it's important for you to be informed about the truth in life issues. And it is that I think is particularly important in your formation, that is, that you seek truth and that you know the truth. The notion of embryonic obligation arises within the issue of cloning. That is somatic cell nuclear transfer for the production of stem cells. And it arises with some urgency today following the report of the National Academy of Sciences in 2002 and the report of the President's Council on Bioethics in 2002, both of which call for a comprehensive national review of all current and projected practices of human embryo research, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, genetic modification of embryos and gametes, and all related matters with a view to recommending and shaping ethically sound policies for the entire field. Now, each report then calls for the study of ethical, social, and religious implications of cloning. I would like to think that each report has called for a sustained national conversation on the issue in a manner appropriate to a democratic republic. And if that is the case, then great care has to be taken that the conversation take place, and that the conversation take place in an appropriate manner. The language must be precise and careful. Sharing of information is essential. Expert testimony that is discipline-specific must be provided. Lessons from history must be accorded proper respect, and all aspect of the proposed action, that is, the object, the intention, and the circumstances, must be considered. Let us turn then to an essential element in that conversation, the starting point. Cloning, the process of somatic cell nuclear transfer, no matter whether the technician's ultimate goal is the production of a child, or the production of stem cell lines, produces an embryo. So if there is to be a sustained study of the issue of cloning, there must be a sustained study of the status of the embryo as the required prelude to any discussion of the possibility of appropriate level of risk, whether physical or societal, to it or to its possible use, whether for compassionate reasons or for intellectual reasons. The first question then to be answered in a national conversation is, what is the embryo? For surely there must be something quite remarkable about it and the powers that lie in it, if from it every human being draws its being and its being in a particular way. And surely, if it is to be destroyed to serve some human good other than its own, it is appropriate to know what it is in order to measure the adequacy of the reasons that would permit its destruction. Both the NAS report and the report of the President's Council shy away from the question. They say it need to be raised, but they shy away from an answer in the report, or even an attempt at an answer, and there are good reasons for this. For some members of both groups, there seems to be an underlying assumption that the question of the status of the embryo has been settled. And for other members of each group, there seems to be a fear of reigniting the abortion debate, as if that debate were not still burning like some mine fire. To attend the question of the status of the embryo is to come face to face with a question that the Supreme Court could not or would not or chose not to answer in 1973. That is the question of the beginning of human life. Since that question is so important, let's examine it first. Now, I know I must do this in a very brief time because Laura and I have limited time here, but let me just do this very quickly. In contemporary bioethics, there are three different claims about the status of the embryo. Significant among them are the following. The embryo is just a set of cells organized now in a particular manner. It is permissible to organize them in another manner so long as the reorganization serves some human good. The second is, the embryo is the earliest stage of human development. It deserves profound respect, but not the respect owed to the more developed forms of life. And the third is, the embryo is a human being at the earliest stage of development of human life, and it deserves the same respect accorded to all other living developing human beings. A brief response to each perspective is appropriate. Those who defend the first sometimes make the claim that the embryo, whether produced sexually or produced by somatic cell nuclear transfer, is just a piece of tissue. Others claim that the embryo produced by somatic cell nuclear transfer is an artifact and is different from the embryo produced by sexual reproduction. Now, while it is true that the method, somatic cell nuclear transfer, of its coming into existence is different, if somatic cell nuclear transfer produces an embryo, then an embryo is in itself different from other types of tissue which remain throughout the life of that tissue, simply that type of tissue. The embryo, if allowed to continue its existence and provided its epigenetic programming and imprinting are intact, is destined to become, given a suitable environment, a very complex being, a more fully developed human being. Those who defend the second position seem on face value to have the least defensible position. They recognize the embryo as an early stage in the life of an individual human being, and they require profound respect for that life, but allow the direct destruction of that life to serve the health or well-being of some other human being. There is something incompatible with the claim to proffer profound respect to an object in an act which counts as the destruction, that is, the killing of the object of that profound respect. The third position is left. Now, it must face up to a variety of questions, including its vitality, its viability, its capacities, its integrity, its distinctness. And those questions have been answered with much care in a host of articles by people like John Noonan, John Crosby, Jean Porter, and I myself have written several articles on that. One will appear in a forthcoming book from Notre Dame University Press. The conclusion presented in these is the following. A human being is an open, unfinished being who begins existence at syngamy, that is, at the union of the gametes, and becomes what it is by developing its potentialities in an environment that is congenial for its development. The becoming, which is described in various stages, is a time-conditioned unfolding of the possibilities given at syngamy. The existential reality at each stage of development is different only in degree of actualization. What exists in the more fully developed human being at a relatively achieved state of affairs exists in the zygote and in the embryo in a relatively unachieved state of affairs. If there is to be intellectual development, there must be prior psychic development. If there is to be psychic development, there must be prior organic development. Each prior stage is the necessary condition for the emergence of each successive stage. And each prior stage anticipates in its development the specification of the next higher stage. It is the same human being who begins in existence, who develops, who matures, who declines and dies. The existential reality of the adult is that of a being who is in action, the fulfillment of the existential reality of the zygote in whose act the sum of potentialities of the being reside. Inasmuch as the embryo is a living, developing human being at a particular stage of development, it is then a member of the moral community and ought to share the same protections as all other members of the moral community. Its life then may not be taken to satisfy some human good other than life. So now we have a starting point. Let's move to the next question. Why all the current interest in the embryo? The reason is that the embryo could be a significant source of human stem cells. The use of stem cells tied to the possibility of increase in scientific knowledge and tied to the possibility of therapeutic efficacy has captured the imagination of scientists and the sympathies of the general public. It is important to note, at the present stage of scientific and medical knowledge, such possible use of stem cells is largely promise. Now, those ends, knowledge and therapy, are good ends, so what's the fuss? Well, the fuss lies at the heart of at the use of embryonic stem cells. So first let me briefly describe stem cells, examine the good that they may offer, and list some of the sources of stem cells, and then move to the central issue in stem cell use. Stem cells are marvelously versatile. They are pluripotent in character. They are unspecialized cells that have the capacity to give rise to many different kinds of cells, all the different types of cells in the human body. Stem cells are present in the bloodstream, in bone marrow, in the umbilical cord, in fetal tissue, and in certain types of tumors, as well as in the inner cell mass of the embryo. Stem cells are considered potentially immortal. That is, they have indefinitely continuous divisional ability without the loss of genetic structure. The potential limitless diversity and the potential immortality of stem cells make them very valuable indeed. It has been suggested that stem cells might be able to generate new nerve cells, and hence might be the source of a cure for spinal cord injuries, or that stem cells might replace impaired or disrupted or damaged brain cells, and hence are a potential cure for Parkinson's disease or for Alzheimer's. It has been suggested that stem cells as a source of heart tissue or other solid organ tissue might make it possible to bypass the problem of organic rejection common in transplantation procedures. And it has been suggested that the study of human development by using the embryo generated in somatic cell nuclear transfer might be the key to preventing the developmental damage for future desired children. Use of stem cells found in the bloodstream, in the bone marrow, in the umbilical cord, and in some fetal tissue, and in certain types of tumor, is morally unproblematic, provided, of course, strict adherence to the regulations for the development of therapeutic modalities is adhered to. A straightforward application of the principle of totality suffices. The cells may be used for the good of the whole, the person. There remains, however, with the use of stem cells taken from the inner cell mass of the embryo. The problem has its source in the fact that at this stage of the technology, the embryo itself is destroyed in the harvesting of the stem cells. If the embryo is a living, developing human being, then its life may not be destroyed to heal illness of other presently developing living human beings, and its life may not be destroyed to serve the good of developmental correction for future living human beings. The rules governing the principle of totality in a moral organism apply here. The principle of totality and its application saw considerable development in the writings of Pope Pius XII. In the face of contemporaneous problems which included such wide-ranging issues as the medical use of sterilization as a form of mutilation required for the preservation of the life of a person, to political uses such as the use of human beings to achieve the political goals of National Socialism and Communism, the Holy Father developed the meaning of the principle of totality and clarified its use. The initial clarification is the distinction between a physical organism and a moral organism, with the corresponding limitation of the application of the principle of totality according to the nature of the organism to which it is applied. An organism is a physical whole if it has unity subsisting in itself, if it has a unity on the level of essence. The relationship of part to the whole exists if the part as a member is an integral part of the physical unity. That is, if it is an integral part destined by all of its being to be inserted in the whole organism. Outside the organism, it has not, by its very nature, any sense, any finality. It is wholly absorbed by the totality of the organism to which it is attached. So, for example, the human body is a physical organism. Its parts have meaning in relationship to the human being. In delineating the application of the principle of totality to a physical unity, the Holy Father had this to say: "Nevertheless, by virtue of the principle of totality, by virtue of his right to use the services of his organism as a whole, the patient can allow individual parts to be destroyed or mutilated when and to the extent necessary for the good of his whole being. He may do so to ensure his being's existence and to avoid or naturally to repair serious or lasting damage which cannot otherwise be avoided or repaired. Now, a moral organism, on the other hand, for example, a community, is a whole which is a union of individuals brought together for the realization of some common good or goal. The individuals who are members of a moral whole have meaning in themselves outside that determined by their role as collaborators in the common enterprise that unites the group. The moral organism has a unity on the level of action. In regard to the community as a moral organism, it is maintained that it is the great means intended by nature and by God to regulate the exchange of mutual needs and to aid each man to develop his personality fully according to his individual and social abilities. In delineating the application of the principle of totality in a moral unity, such as a community, Pope Pius XII, in addressing physician experimenters, had this to say, and I quote, "I think an overwhelming majority of physician experimenters, if not thoroughly aware of the nature of the original physician-patient relationship, are so deeply rooted in the democratic spirit that they agree and will continue to agree that the use of force is not justified on a single person, even if millions of other lives could be saved by such an act. They realized that the act would not just save millions of lives, but that as an amoral act from the standpoint of democratic brotherhood, it might create millions of amoral sequels, and that the moral history of mankind is more important than its scientific." From the distinction of organisms, then, as either a physical or a moral whole, there follows the corresponding limitation of action in the application of the principle of totality. If the organism is a physical union, the agent is permitted the direct disposal of the part for the good of the whole. A diseased arm may be removed for the good, the survival of the person, or a diseased organ, a cancerous uterus, might be removed for the good of the person. On the other hand, if the organism is a moral unity, the application of the principle is limited to the activities of the members, not to the physical being of the members in the service of the whole. The good of the community may require the service as activity only, of the members of the community as parts of the whole. It cannot require the life of one member of the community in the service of a good of some other member of the moral community. So the good of a nation, its racial purity or elimination of classes, or its health, would be limited to the use of the activities of the part, the activities of the members of the community, not the lives of the members of the community. The application of this understanding of the principle of totality to the use of stem cells from embryos to serve the good of other human beings requires the limitation to the use of the activities of the embryo. It does not permit the destruction of its life. Most significant here is only the activities, not the life of the part of the embryo, may be used for the good of the whole, the person who would receive stem cells or the society that would benefit from the research. And herein lies the foundation of the question of justice. In summary, then, the acknowledgement of the ontological status of the embryo as a living, developing human being has to be the starting point. All other issues must reference this ontological status when weighing the appropriateness or the inappropriateness of an action, or an action on or to or for this being. And the understanding of the principle of totality and the understanding of the limits of its application serve to distinguish permissible from impermissible use of the part for the good of the whole. If the embryo is a living, developing human being, then justice requires that its life and its well-being be accorded the same protection as any other human being. Its parts may be used for the good of the whole of its own being, but only its activities may be used to serve the good of the community. Considerations of mercy, the amelioration of illness for one human being cannot be assuaged by an action that countenances the destruction of another human being. Despite the understanding of the limitation inherent in the application of the principle of totality, there are two powerful arguments in the contemporary culture that are fueling a powerful press for the use of the embryo in the production of stem cells. So powerful is this press that it threatens to eclipse the reality of the act, that is, the object of the act. The first is the argument from compassion, and the second, the argument from obligation. Let me tend them now. The argument from compassion always sounds something like this. As many as 128 million Americans suffer from diseases that might respond to pluripotent stem cell therapies. Even if that is an optimistic number, many clinical research and cell biologists hold that stem cell therapies will be critical in treating cancer, heart disease, and degenerative diseases of aging such as Parkinson's disease. More than half of the world's population will suffer at some point in life from one of these three conditions, and more human beings die each year from cancer than were killed in both the Kosovo and the Vietnam conflicts. This quote continues, "Stem cell research is a pursuit of known and important moral goods." Now this is from Art Kaplan and Glenn McGee, but this is really the central thought in much of contemporary bioethics. Note that the move is made from the mercy imperative and the scientific imperative to an obligation to sacrifice the human embryo. Now compassion is a powerful emotion. It allows us to share with other human beings the pain and suffering of this life, and in that sharing to mitigate the sting of pain and suffering. However, compassion untethered to truth is a blind and dangerous emotion. Recall that compassion was a powerful element which, when joined with utilitarianism and utopianism, and I think you see those same elements in McGee and Kaplan, fueled the implementation and the horrendous success of the euthanasia movement in Nazi Germany. Robert J. Lifton, in his work, The Nazi Doctors, recounts the influence of the motive of compassion in the killing of those whose lives had no worth, those whose lives represented a burden on the healthy life of the vault. The first moment in the compassionate killing movement began with the killing of children. Petitions for mercy killing were received by the Chancellor of the Reich. The first child to be euthanized was an infant named Nauer. The child was born blind. He was missing one arm. He was missing part of one arm and one leg, and he had been diagnosed as an idiot. His father petitioned for the mercy killing of his child. To move the program forward, Hitler ordered Karl Brandt, his personal physician, to oversee the determination of the child's condition, to initiate the process with physicians, and to assure the physicians of the legal protection of the Fuhrer. Lifton recounts the first killing of the euthanasia movement, the killing of this unfortunate child, in the words of the child's father. The father said, "It was right here. Karl Brandt was standing there near the window. He was tall and impressive. He seemed to fill up the whole room. He explained to me that the Fuhrer had personally sent him and that my son's case interested the Fuhrer very, very much. The Fuhrer wanted to explore the problem of people who had no future, whose lives were worthless. From then on," he said, "we would not have to suffer from this terrible misfortune because the Fuhrer had granted us the mercy of killing our son. Later we could have other children, handsome and healthy, of whom the Reich would be proud. Germany had to be built and every bit of energy would be required. That's what Herr Braun explained to me. He was a proud man, intelligent and very convincing. He was like a savior to us, the man who could deliver us from so heavy a burden. We thanked him and we told him how grateful we were." Note here, compassion as mercy for the parents and mercy for the child. Neither this child nor the family would continue to suffer. Note too the transfer of authority. The full weight of the authority of the state, represented here in the grand figure of Dr. Karl Brandt, the personal representative of the Fuhrer, would dispense mercy. Responsibility of the parents and of the physicians was transferred to the Reich. This particular child is just a child, a fungible entity to be replaced by some future child, a healthy, handsome child. The larger good, the good of the Reich, would be served. Mercy had so blinded reason that there was no place for considerations of what is owed, considerations of justice, to this particular child by the parents or by the community. What do we learn from this? Well, what we need to learn is that the acceptance of beneficent or compassionate killing of human beings is an inappropriate tool of human advancement and an inappropriate tool for the amelioration of human suffering. We need to learn, too, that once accepted, it is difficult to limit its application. Let us now turn briefly to the question of obligation of the embryo to sacrifice its life for the good of society. Again, this is argued by several prominent bioethicists who suggest that there would be much to be gained if the issue were to be recentered away from the question of the ontological status of the embryo and toward a focus on the criteria for moral sacrifices of human beings. They make the argument that no human being should be allowed to lie unaided in preventable harm and suffering. To this we would all agree. And they raise the question as to what sort of sacrifice the embryo might be called upon to serve the interests of the common good. Kaplan and McGee write, one would expect that the destruction of embryonic life, whatever its moral status, would also take place under the most scrupulous conditions and for the best communal reasons. Now, in the first place, the ontological status of the embryo is the starting point, and this starting point cannot be dismissed by a flippant whatever its moral status. Whatever. It sounds like it's come right from Buffy and company. In the second place, Kaplan and McGee seem to have a truncated understanding of the notion of the common good and the principles which underlie the pursuit of the common good. For them, the common good seems equivalent to the good of those in power. And they seem to understand the central ethical principle as the maximization of medical benefits for the greatest number of people. They are unmindful of what Paul Ramsey wrote more than 25 years ago, what he called the independent moral limit upon the fashion in which the rest of mankind can be made the ultimate beneficiary of a procedure. That is, in the application of the principle of the maximization of good, there are deontological limits which cannot be transgressed. Recall, too, that the notion of the common good describes not just a system of advantages and utility, but rather rectitude of life, good in and of itself. The common good is a good both causally common and utilitarian common. Understanding the common good to serve the good of society, good of civil order, and the good of the individuals in society, just distribution of goods, and the understanding of the embryo as a member of the moral community would require the prescription of the direct destruction of the embryo for the good of other members of society. Third, how does one talk about obligation or sacrifice by human beings who have not yet reached the stage where they can give consent to such activity on behalf of the common good? This question was enjoined many years ago by Paul Ramsey and Richard McCormick. Their particular focus at the time was children as subjects in medical investigation. McCormick suggested that the affirmation of solidarity and the Christian concern for others might make possible the construction of consent based on a reasonable presumption of the child's wishes. He grounded the child's wishes in the natural law tradition of the goods of human flourishing. That tradition holds that there are certain identifiable goods that we ought to support, attempt to realize, and never directly suppress because they are definitive of our well-being. However, McCormick's affirmation was carefully circumscribed by limits of harm to the child. There may be, he said, no discernible risk and no undue discomfort. McCormick warned, too, that without careful attention to the proper limits, the door is wide open to a utilitarian subordination of the individual to the collectivity. And this is my point now, if the embryo is a living, developing human being, and Father McCormick certainly contended that very strongly, if it is a living, developing human being at the earlier stage of development, then there can be no presumed consent to its destruction for the good of someone else. The fundamental good, the good of life, is required if any of the other goods of human flourishing are to be possible. Ramsey argued powerfully that the canon of loyalty, which is foundational to informed consent, precludes the use of children in research that serves no benefit to the child. He said, to attempt to consent for a child to be made an experimental subject is to treat a child as not a child. If the grounds for this are alleged to be the presumptive or implied consent of the child, that must simply be characterized as a violent and a false presumption. Let me close with a quote from Gil Meilander. Gil was writing on the moral point of the ban, and he said, how then ought we to address those who, because we place a ban on cloning for research, how then do we explain to them the reason why we put in place this moral ban on this kind of research? And I think you'll find in Gil Meilander's quote here an echo of what the Holy Father had to say more than 50 years ago. Gil says this, we must say to them, perhaps we could have helped you, but only by pretending that our responsibility to do good is godlike, that it knows no limit. Only by supposing, as modernity has taught us, that suffering has no point other than to be overcome by human will and technical mastery. That compassion means not a readiness to suffer with others, but a determination always to oppose suffering as an affront to our humanity. We could have helped you, but only by destroying in the present the sort of world in which both we and you want to live, a world in which justice is done now, not permanently mortgaged in service of some future. Only, in short, by pretending to be something other than the human beings that we are. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peg. We'll move now directly to our second speaker, and because the talks are linked, then we'll save the questions for our conclusion. Laura?
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here and to reflect on these matters together with my friend Professor Hogan. Actually, our talks are linked, and always in weird ways that weren't necessarily intended by us explicitly, but I think our concerns are dovetail on these matters. My talk has to do with several contemporary efforts to develop a kind of respect for persons of the sort that both Professor Hogan and I think is so important, but in a worldview that's explicitly hostile to the existence of God, explicitly atheistic. And I think that project fails, and so at the end they try to offer a more promising alternative. So this has to do with, in a way, how to ground this sort of ontology of persons that Professor Hogan thinks so important that we preserve. Several contemporary devotees of atheism offer moral theories that purport to capture the substance of morality within a worldview explicitly committed to materialism. The recent entries in this category share the view that many of the ethical norms endorsed by religious believers, especially Christian believers, are pernicious and should be eliminated. That is, their goal is not to develop a naturalistic moral theory that will justify traditional moral norms, but rather to develop a theory that will justify replacing these norms with more progressive or enlightened moral principles. I'm going to consider here briefly three such anti-theistic theories, along with some criticisms of each approach. And finally, I propose a renewal of metaphysical inquiry as crucial to sustaining a sound and persuasive natural law ethics. In this regard, I believe the task of formation is especially about putting our own house in order. So first one of these naturalist proposals by Kai Nielsen, a Canadian philosopher who published a book in 1972 called Ethics Without God. In 1990, the book reappeared under the same title, but it was revised and greatly expanded. The earlier version simply endorsed a consequentialist moral theory directly, but sometime in the 1980s, Nielsen tried to assimilate John Rawls' moral theory with mixed success, I think. Nielsen's current theory proposes what he takes to be, anyway, a Rawlsian methodology of wide reflective equilibrium, which he describes as follows. We start with firmly fixed, considered moral judgments, such as the belief that religious or racial intolerance is unacceptable, that promises must not be broken, that we need to have regard for the truth, that people are never to be treated as means only, and the like. Starting with these considered moral convictions that we hold most firmly, we see whether we can arrange them into a coherent and, of course, consistent package. We should also take the extant moral theories and see how well they match with these considered judgments. The relation is much like that of scientific theories to observed experimental data. The theory that squares best with and explains best this consistent set of confidently held considered judgments is, ceteris paribus, the theory we should accept. Now, this approach sounds relatively harmless at first blush, apart from who's going to be included in the we with reference to whose considered moral judgments we must square a moral theory. This is no idle concern, as becomes apparent when Nielsen describes the data set he has in mind. He says wide reflective equilibrium must not only seek the most coherent fit possible between considered moral judgments and moral theories, it must also seek the most accurate account available to us of the non-moral facts and the best social, scientific, and philosophical theories we have. Nielsen wastes no time in letting us know which philosophical theories count as best in this context. He says, many Christians believe that under all circumstances, suicide is wrong, abortion is wrong, and premarital intercourse is wrong. According to some Christians, God categorically forbids suicide, and so they conclude suicide is wrong. But there are serious and deep questions about whether the concept of God is a coherent concept. And beyond that, even if we can make sense of the concept, there's still the problem of whether there is a God or whether belief in God is rationally justified. Now, Nielsen does not pause here to consider whether prohibitions against suicide, abortion, and premarital sex might be derivable from one of his own considered judgments, for instance, the claim that persons are never to be treated merely as means to an end. He instead mainly criticizes divine command theories of morality here. Turning to his own proposal for an ethic without God, we find that it remains, in the 1990 version, a form of consequentialism. Nielsen starts with judgments about what things are intrinsically good and that we pursue them for their own sake. The only absolute norm, however, is a consequentialist maxim. It goes like this. Actions, rules, policies, practices, and moral principles are ultimately to be judged by certain consequences, to wit, whether doing them more than, or at least as much as, doing anything else, or acting in accordance with them, these principles, more than, or at least as much as, acting in accordance with alternative principles. Philosophers like to talk like that. Right, you can always just omit that middle junk, okay? Tends on the whole, and for everyone involved, to maximize satisfaction. That is, to maximize happiness, minimize pain, enhance self-consciousness, and preserve one's sense of self-identity. Nielsen is mildly troubled, at least momentarily, that his theory fails to ground any other moral absolutes. But he thinks it's obvious that there are going to be hard cases where doing evil that good may come is not only permissible, but even obligatory. Right? The cases of the sort that I think Professor Hogan was describing. Some of his examples are eerily relevant in today's climate. Certain acts of terrorism that target innocent people are justified by their effects, in his view, when no other means of achieving the aims of the terrorist group, and let's suppose that these are good aims, present themselves. He says, in certain almost unavoidable circumstances, they must deliberately kill the innocent. Specifically, the example he gives is in the film The Battle of Algiers. He says, Algerian women, gentle women with children of their own, and plainly people of moral sensitivity, with evident heaviness of heart, planted bombs that they had every reason to believe would kill innocent people, including children. Now, those are the gentle and morally sensitive women. Okay? Against Elizabeth Anscombe's defense of moral absolutes, Nielsen pronounces that insisting on obedience to a moral law when it involves great sacrifices for oneself or others is a morally monstrous position. That's his term, morally monstrous position, since one should always choose the lesser evil, he thinks. Consider a moral principle Nielsen endorsed at the beginning of his book, that persons must never be treated as instrumental to an extrinsic end, an end outside themselves. As the book progresses, this bold principle dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. It turns out that, first, the fact that a normative ethical theory is incompatible with some of our moral intuitions, moral feelings or convictions, does not refute the normative ethical theory. So none of the data apparently is taken to be absolute or riveted here. You can throw out a few. Secondly, the Kantian norm about respect for persons requires that we treat them initially as equally deserving of respect, instrumentalizing them only with great reluctance. Right? And I guess heaviness of heart. And so, okay. Finally, we do not treat Jones, let's say, only as a means to an end in killing him to save ourselves or benefit others and so forth, as long as we don't single him out because of anything peculiar to him, and we have humane reasons for acting as we do. Presumably they won't seem humane to Jones, but you can't have everything. Right? So, It's not just moral absolutes that find no foothold in Nielsen's theory, but moral truth of any kind. His definition of truth here is this: a moral principle is true if it is required by the moral point of view, what he calls the moral point of view, that is, one which adopts his consequentialist maxim. As to why we should adopt this moral point of view, the only reason given is that societies need a moral code of some kind in order to have something higher to appeal to than the positive law and the will of the majority. Pragmatic considerations ultimately determine which point of view one adopts then. Nielsen's appeal to wide reflective equilibrium is no accident, since he wields Occam's razor to shave off all moral theories incompatible with a strict materialist ontology. No philosophical case is made in favor of this naturalistic worldview, since it's assumed to be the default position of the well-educated. Right, a second example, philosopher Michael Moore, a living philosopher, not to be confused with G.E. Moore, but spelled the same way, 2 O's, hopes to find a place for moral realism and objective moral norms within a moral intuitionist theory along the lines of that offered by, confusingly enough, G.E. Moore. Michael Moore treats good, the term good, as an impersonal, natural quality that we postulate to be present in some objects and actions. In a 1996 collection of essays edited by Robbie George of Princeton called Natural Law, Liberalism, and Morality, Moore considers this question: would the existence of God help at all in justifying our belief that morality is objective? Would God's existence strengthen the case for morality's objectivity? His answer is that it would not, and he ultimately suggests that God's existence might be incompatible with morality's objectivity. Moore defends a position he calls moral realism, a twofold metaphysical claim that first, moral qualities such as goodness, wrongness, and so on exist, and second, the existence of such moral qualities does not depend on what any person or group of persons believes about them. For Moore, moral qualities are natural properties of things, and facts about which activities, relations, or states are good to do or good to be in are simply evident to us. That's the kind of intuitionist aspect of this. One cannot ground their moral value in anything further, including any facts about human nature or human desires. Rather, he says, our actions, relations, or states possess the quality of goodness, a quality existing in the universe, like wetness. And human actions need not be the only things in the universe that possess this quality, according to Moore. If a work of art has the property of being good, for instance, it will be good whether or not there is any beholder in the universe, God included. Values are to be completely independent, on Moore's view, not just of persons' beliefs, right, which seems obviously true to me, but also of persons' needs, desires, ends, or motives. Values are not simply mind independent then, but wholly impersonal, wholly independent of anything about persons. On the other hand, Moore wants moral truths to do some work in guiding human actions and choices. If an action is morally right, or state of affairs morally good, he says, necessarily we have an objective, non-prudential reason to pursue it. Now, how this is supposed to follow in Moore's theory is difficult to see. In a critique of Moore's essay, Jorge Garcia, a philosopher at Boston College, brilliant philosopher at Boston College, asks this question: what makes value give people reasons to act if that value has no necessary connection to what advances any person's goals, projects, plans, needs, purposes, or function? Moore's version of moral realism goes well beyond the claim that the good is independent of what people believe about the good to the claim that it's just independent of people altogether. The grounding of absolute moral norms was a problem for Nielsen's naturalist moral theory. It turns out to be an equally grave problem for Moore. While an explicit appeal to a theistic worldview is not necessary for coming to know that there are some important and serious moral norms, it's next to impossible, I think, within a naturalistic worldview to show why these moral norms should not be compromised in the face of the so-called hard cases. Moore believes, I take it, that generally speaking, murder is wrong, incest is wrong, and torturing prisoners is wrong. But he denies that moral norms can be captured in what he calls text-like formulations like do not kill. He says one must grant exceptions to the commandment do not kill for actions such as killing in defense of one's life or one's family, killing in defense of one's country if one is a soldier, and so on. And he says new exceptions will always be in principle discoverable. Moore seems oblivious to any common elements in his list of exceptions, or of the need to rule out pseudo-exceptions, like killing because we're really, really angry. Right? He concludes that there is no finite proposition that can capture moral principles. Stated in propositional form, they can only be guidelines as to what is prima facie right or wrong, right? On the face of it, right or wrong. Just as in Nielsen's theory, one can be morally obligated to violate a fundamental principle to prevent great enough harms or promote great enough goods. Moore confidently opines that one who would not kill or lie to save his family is in no sense a saint, but rather a kind of misguided moral leper. Similar considerations apply to incest, by the way. He says we might come across, actually or imaginatively in literature, I guess it depends what kind of literature you read, but incestuous relationships that enhance the dignity of persons in ways we had not anticipated. It's probably fair to say we hadn't anticipated that, but in which event, he says, we might withdraw our initial judgment that incest is even prima facie wrong, right? That it's not even wrong on the face of it. Right, now I'm going to turn from that view to the psychologist Steven Pinker, who works in evolutionary psychology. He stands out, I think, among popularizers of the evolutionary paradigm as the key to understanding nearly everything there is to know about human beings and their behavior. The key assumption of this approach is a view of the human mind as identical with the brain, or maybe a mere epiphenomenon of brain activity. And the brain has evolved into its present form over vast millennia by way of random variations and natural selection. As Pinker puts it in the preface of his 1997 book, How the Mind Works, the mind is a system of organs of computation designed by natural selection to solve the problems faced by our evolutionary ancestors in their foraging way of life. Now, this assumption opens up a whole new discipline in the academic world of evolutionary psychology, which claims to find the physical causes in the evolutionary history of the human race that lie behind virtually every emotion, belief, and practice of human beings. The field of evolutionary psychology is riddled with post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacies. I just want to throw that in there. After this, therefore, because of this. Since the fact that certain conditions obtained in the distant past that could perhaps account for current human beliefs, desires, and so on, does nothing to show that these conditions were, in fact, the cause of those beliefs or desires. Even apart from the disputed notion of agent causation, free will, one could attribute a large role to environmental and cultural factors in explaining a person's behavior and outlook. Instead, neo-Darwinian theories of human nature attribute nearly every such factor to the genes, and the goal of our genes is to reproduce themselves. They are selfish genes. If we care about our children, it's due ultimately to our interest in preserving our own genetic legacy. If we tend toward melancholy, this will probably have a genetic explanation too, maybe in terms of blue genes. As for... Sorry, okay. I know. Okay, I apologize for that. Okay. As for moral beliefs, okay, that's our topic. These are assumed to reflect various human emotional reactions to different objects and practices. Reactions that contributed at some point to the survival of the individual or of the species. As emotions, they are neither true nor false. Pinker says, people have gut feelings that give them emphatic moral convictions, and they struggle to rationalize the convictions after the fact. Right? Moral convictions about what is good and bad, right or wrong, can have no objective or realist basis, and moral reasoning is just rationalization then. One assumes Pinker will go on to embrace moral nihilism, or some type of non-cognitivism, since there are no moral facts in his view. Instead, he endorses consequentialism again, as the one moral theory that reason would recommend. Here's his defense. He says the difference between a defensible moral position and an atavistic gut feeling is that with the former, we can give reasons why our conviction is valid. We can explain why torture and murder and rape are wrong. Perhaps you should check with Michael Moore about torture and murder. Or why we should oppose discrimination and injustice. On the other hand, no good reasons can be produced to show why homosexuality should be suppressed or why the races should be segregated. Notice he throws those together. And the good reasons for a moral position are not pulled out of thin air. They always have to do with what makes people better off or worse off, and are grounded in the logic that we have to treat other people in the way we demand they treat us. I don't know how that last one fits in, but it's remarkable that Pinker can know that promoting people's welfare and following the golden rule, if we do follow it, are grounded in reason, while other moral principles are mere rationalizations of gut feelings. As it turns out, even the golden rule quickly succumbs to consequentialist considerations, since making people better off turns out to be mainly a matter of making oneself better off. Others are out of luck. When Pinker turns to a consideration of particular moral judgments, his main concern is to eliminate moral absolutes and to completely erase moral prohibitions against the favored projects of current medical science, in vitro fertilization and cloning, for instance, and the favored practices of the cultural elite, especially sexual practices. Moral absolutes are dismissed as efforts to treat an act in terms of virtue and sin, as opposed to cost and benefit, when we all know that considerations of virtue and vice are morally irrelevant grounds, he says, his phrase, morally irrelevant grounds. Two examples Pinker mentions in the realm of sexual ethics are incest, apparently a favorite among atheist moral theories these days, and, of all things, sex with a chicken. He assures us many moral philosophers would say there is nothing wrong with these acts. They would? Well, maybe they would. I mean, I hope not. It's a sign of the times if they would. Because private acts among consenting adults that do not harm other sentient beings are not immoral. A mention of sentient beings might lead to some concerns about the chicken, but let's pass over that for the time being. The claim that human persons are inviolable, that they cannot be instrumentalized, grounds many of the moral principles that come under attack in The Blank Slate, another book by Pinker. Prohibitions against abortion, particularly, even against auctioning orphans to the highest bidder among prospective adoptive parents, against harvesting organs from living people who are just kind of close to death. None survives Pinker's cost-benefit test. The following is a sample of Pinkerian moral analysis. As recently as 1978, many people shuddered at the new technology of in vitro fertilization, or as it was then called, test tube babies. But now it is morally unexceptionable, and for hundreds of thousands of people, a source of immeasurable happiness or of life itself. Of course, it's also a source of death or suspended animation for hundreds of thousands of other people at the embryonic stage, but this fails to register. Why is the death of these small persons not counted at all, even if only to be overridden by a so-called higher good? The answer can be found in a telling passage on the morality of abortion, wherein Pinker shows his devotion to materialism and scientism. He says the idea that ensoulment takes place at conception flouts the key moral intuition that people are worthy of moral consideration because of their feelings, their ability to love, think, play, enjoy, and suffer, all of which depend on a functioning nervous system. That's the kind of claim that can take your breath away. People are worthy of moral consideration because of their feelings and their abilities alone. What justifies Pinker's fundamental claims about who is worthy of moral consideration? One assumes he's thinking of the pervasiveness of the naturalist worldview, where claims of intrinsic moral worth can never feel at home. All right, so I turn at last to another proposal. Thomas and other advocates of the natural law share the view that some substantive moral claims are objectively true, and that these are accessible by the use of human reason. There are differences over what kinds of moral claims can be grounded in this way, the ground or the warrant for these claims, and the way in which they are known. And I think I'm going to skip over some of the differences here. But they all, I think, what they have in common is that they presuppose a certain view about human beings. They presuppose, I think, a non-materialist and immaterialist aspect of the human being, soul, and they presuppose possibility of free will, the actual ability of free will in a normal human being, agent causality. Contemporary, and therefore they depend on a certain metaphysics or a certain view of the person. Contemporary academia is severely allergic to metaphysics and to these kind of ontological questions, and I think Professor Hogan's survey here of the opinions on cloning are just another indication of that. And this desire to distance oneself from the intellectual odiousness of metaphysics, and this affects, I think, every other area of philosophy, including moral philosophy. But it's increasingly clear that substantive metaphysical truths lie at the foundation of substantive moral truths, and that the metaphysical task can't be postponed indefinitely. Indeed, it becomes even more urgent today in light of the escalating assaults on human dignity from reproductive technologies and from social forces in a culture riveted to self-gratification. In light of these realities, I believe we should undertake a renewed study of metaphysics, accompanied by a robust realism and a deep respect for reason and common sense. Within anthropology, it might be promising to develop a theory of human nature that draws on both the Aristotelian Thomistic understanding of man as a rational social animal and on the relational personalist themes of Pope John Paul II. The goal would be to build a persuasive and substantive metaphysical foundation for natural law ethics, particularly where ethics addresses human sexuality. In his masterful encyclical on faith and reason, Pope John Paul II opens with this beautiful image. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. In seeking the truth about morality, reason is greatly helped by faith, even if neither the mysteries of faith nor the existence of God is presupposed in natural law theories. Nearly everyone begins with the moral intuition that the dignity of human persons is inviolable, but secular moralities seldom retain it in the end. Most people begin with a belief in an immaterial dimension of the self, in fact, and in free will as the basis of moral responsibility. Without faith, one could be tempted to surrender these metaphysical intuitions and so destroy the very foundations of morality. I'm a firm believer in the possibility of developing a sound natural law ethics without explicit appeal to articles of the faith, but when philosophical ethics explicitly rejects God and embraces naturalistic materialism, such moralities does not have a prayer. Two wings are better than one, even if you can make it with one. And if we attempt to do morality without metaphysics, we won't even have a whole wing, maybe just a few feathers. Thank you.
We do have some time now for questions. Yes, sir.
I would just like to ask both panelists, responding to what Professor Garcia said at the end, it seems to me so obvious that without a metaphysics, all of our moral discourse will collapse. If we say that developing human beings are there only insofar as they manifest their humanity, we're saying their appearance is all that matters, and not their being. And if we talk about what being is, we're inevitably forced to talk about ability. Even the last person, Pinker, talks about the ability to love. Well, the embryo has the ability. You just have to wait. It has that ability. It has that design. So it seems to me that the attempt to justify cloning and abortion and these other things are ultimately lead to the conclusion that the person as such doesn't exist. Persons are like, this isn't a perfect analogy, they're like rainbows. They seem to sort of be there, and we kind of enjoy watching them, but they're not really there at all. It seems to me that's an obvious kind of conclusion from this materialist approach. Why do they think they can still construct any sort of ethics, even a consequentialist ethics, once they've done away with the metaphysics of personhood?
Well, I don't think you can have an adequate ethic without an appropriate metaphysics of person. And the metaphysics of person... You have to have an adequate metaphysics of person, and it cannot be based simply on abilities at the moment. It has to be based on what the being is in act, and in that act lie the potentialities as active natural potentialities for future development. So you need to make explicit that metaphysics, and that's really been absent because it's been dismissed. And I think it's very important. In replace of that has come this metaphysic of person. But as it operates in the contemporary horizon, it's a juristic fiction. That is, the person is the being who will have legal standing, and we can decide who will and who will not have legal standing. So I think we've replaced that metaphysics with the older metaphysic, the more foundational and valid metaphysics. So we need to get outside of that. We have to show the deficiencies of considering only that metaphysic of person, which collapses it into a juristic notion. And we can do that by attending how that has operated in history and how that has been an occasion for the exclusion of particular human beings from the protection of the law. But we have to do that, and we have to do that carefully, and I think that's the role that academics have to play in this whole discussion, and I think that's why it's so important that we have this opportunity, especially with young people here, not only in this institution, but in other institutions.
Peter?
For Peg, thank you for both. Even with the bad blue jeans. Comment. As I try and get notes and come away for my limited knowledge of the world, one of the things that comes through very clearly from Peg and also from Laura is the killing of human beings is an inappropriate way of helping society. That seems to be a message that you both are putting forth here. And I guess the question for you is this a concept that applies just to cloning and genetic reproduction, or does it have a larger arena to be applied?
Well, Peter's going to go down the war path.
Yeah, I take the principle to be that people should not be sacrificed by others, for sure. The question of whether you can, in a heroic way, not kill yourself, but I mean, put yourself in severe danger or almost certitude of being killed by somebody else for the sake of the community, that's a different case, it seems to me, because it's chosen. I mean, the question about consent and so forth, I think, enter in there that Professor Hogan was talking about. I mean, if one sees something like, sending soldiers into the war or whatever as seeing, just using them instrumentally for some other end, then that wouldn't be acceptable. I guess I don't see it that way, but I mean, some of these are the moral principles themselves, which we might agree about, and then the application of them, where we might disagree.
Professor Rogers?
I had a question. It's kind of on the border of biology and metaphysics, I guess I should say. And it has to do with the embryo, and particularly the problem of twinning. At one point, the embryo is a single organism, and then in some cases it splits and it becomes two organisms, which are two people. I've seen this somewhere, the argument then is made that the status of the embryo in its original state obviously is somehow less than a complete human being because the next stage is two human beings. Could you address that question? I'd be absolutely
I would be delighted to address it. The only thing is it takes at least an hour and a half to address it, but let me just at least get started with it. And let me say that monozygous twinning is a relatively rare occurrence, and we don't know the etiology of it. It's been reported that it may occur accidentally, and if it does occur accidentally, level of oxygen. So if it does occur accidentally, then we don't need to worry about it as part of our moral theory, okay? Because it's an accidental occurrence. Secondly, I think the issue of totipotentiality comes into this. In the early stages, this being whatever it is, has this wonderful capacity to reproduce not only cells, but to reproduce itself. Now, that may be a kind of regulation process. That is that on account of severe injury that may occur to it, that this capacity for totipotentiality serves the good of the developing being or beings. Okay, so it's a very complex issue that would have to be developed over a long period of time. But the issue of cloning is different from the issue of twinning. The issue of twinning is an extremely rare, and everybody has this in their textbooks. And it's in their biology textbooks, as far as I've seen it, that it's a relatively rare thing, and that it's suspected that it occurs accidentally, so it's not a normal occurrence. This totipotentiality, a particular power that the embryo has at this space-time allows the development of these two beings. But then we get these very mysterious things that happen with twins, so we're kind of confounded with some of that. So I can't say that I answered all of the questions, and I danced a little bit around it, but that's about the best I can do in this time slot on that issue.
Yes, sir. And then I'll go to the back.
I wanted to ask a question about your response or your answer to the problem. You say it's metaphysics, and I'm worried that you're just using metaphysics as sort of a broad term for philosophy in general. Aristotle defines the study of metaphysics as the science of being as a being, and that is not to be confused with anthropology, as known as the Dhyana, which is the being as a human, or the physical sciences. So it's physics and all those other sciences where you really get the study of causality before causes. Also his logical works seem to be very important. The metaphysics, the only thing I can see the metaphysics specifically would be helpful is in relation to potency and act. But he treats that first, before, in the Dhyana. So I guess I'm just wondering, in the Aristotelian, Thomistic, and scholastic traditions, metaphysics is understood particularly as this science of being, as being, not as just sort of a general philosophical endeavor.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm using the term in a different way, that's for sure, but I'm not using it as synonymous with all of philosophy either. I think that in sort of contemporary parlance, metaphysics has come to mean just the study of what there is, of reality, of the nature of the real, and mainly the nature of reality independent of empirical stuff, right, which is kind of taken over by the sciences these days, unless it's a kind of meta question about what kind of credence should we give to scientific theories and so forth. But it's mainly a study of what there is other than that, and causality, for instance, enters in just because it's not taken up by the other sciences and so forth. So in a way, it's kind of a hodgepodge of things. If you offer a course in metaphysics, you might deal with the nature of space and time, causality, whether there is such a thing as a soul, right? Questions of dualism, materialism, and so forth, and also questions about the existence of God or the nature of God. So I do think that, right, I'm not using it in the same sense. On the other hand, what I mean the reason I bring it up is because I'm mainly talking about claims about the human person, whether, and it might be possible to defend these claims. I hope it is. I believe it is within a kind of Thomistic and Aristotelian view of the person and of distinction between form and matter and so on. But there may be other ways of, there may be other approaches also, or other ways of confirming that or adding to that case from other approaches in philosophy, other methodologies, other considerations. And so I think of it as, I guess, very important that we support certain claims about the person, certain truths about the human person, and find rational ways of doing that that can appeal to, I guess that can appeal and that can be understood easily by people today. I sometimes think the Aristotelian way of putting it, if we stick with that, at least, not the view, but the terminology, is off-putting to people. It sounds like now you have to go back to the 13th century for review of the person. Well, why? I mean, if it's true now. We should be able to put it in terms that are accessible and understandable to people. So I think that project really needs to be taken up in a serious way. But that's just my take.
Professor Diallo?
I have a question about how far even claiming an essentialist metaphysics as a person can get you. I mean, it's already a huge leap, I think, to go from sort of naturalistic materialism to reclaiming something that could be called human nature in the metaphysical sense, or an essence as such. But I'm wondering if you think that that would give us enough, whether that's going to do enough ethical work for us, in the sense of keeping it sort of on the metaphysical plane, as opposed to understanding the human person in transcendent terms, or as a nature which is open to something more than even what metaphysics can provide for us. And I'd be interested in your sense of that.
Let me just get this started, and I know Laura and I always wind up with the most interesting group of people out there because you ask such interesting questions. I think the metaphysical question is a starting point. What is the individual human being? When does this individual human being come into existence? I think that's a starting point. Then I think the next step is the question of what are we? What are we as human beings? And our nature, our being as human beings is that we exist in these various real relationships which define us too as persons, and I think that that has to be explored. So when we acknowledge the fact that we exist as creatures, that immediately puts us in relationship to a creator. When we know that we exist in a way that we have these particular roles that are ours, that bring about these various ontological transformations in our lives, from these roles we get specific obligations. So I think that you begin with the metaphysics of the individual person, and then you move beyond that to what it is to be a human being, and that is to be a human being whose life is constituted in this tension of the individual and the individual as related to other persons and other beings, the order in which we find ourselves in the created world.
Yes, sorry.
I'm a high school theology teacher, and I was really struck by Professor Hogan about your comment about this kind of compassion ethic, where it's okay if you have compassion to kill. And at times I've heard in my classes, students comment about, well, we should just sterilize, all African women because then there would be no more poor, hungry children. So first, I'm not sure if the question is answerable, but in what ways has the materialist kind of notion of a human person filtered into American Catholic thought, or at least American Catholics in general? And then how do I, as a high school teacher of theology, sort of address that at a high school level? I mean, what do I do with that?
You stop us.
Yeah, Laura looked at me and she said, well, go ahead, I think for high school students, I think you have to tell, the narrative helps. You have to tell them the stories of this is how, that's why I cited, especially for the students here, if you take a look at a work like Lipton's Berkel and the Nazi Doctors, that this kind of argumentation, the emotion of compassion, the pull toward mercy is so powerful that unless you can, by way of stories, move them to another level, then you can begin saying, well, what are the limits to compassion? What are you willing to do? I think that's the only way you can do it. That's the only way that I can do it with young students.
Suggestion there. I agree with Professor Hogan on that. It seems to me that's a good approach. But another option might be, and just to add to that, you might just discuss with them the fact that it's easy to feel compassion for the victims of various, Parkinson's and so forth, because they're so, we see ourselves as similar, right? We connect with them visually and imaginatively. With an embryo, it's very easy not to feel compassion for that human life, because it's not as recognizably human in a way. And but you might just mention that the same way, sort of historically, the way in which the child in the womb has become increasingly visible and accessible to us at earlier and earlier stages. We're not going all the way back to embryo here, but now as soon as you go in to find out whether you're pregnant or not, you can often see an ultrasound of the little person in there, and swim her out and so forth, right? Which is just remarkable. So it's made it possible in a way for that imaginative connection, and just so that's in a way kind of arbitrary. It depends on our technological abilities and so forth, making people seem real to us as people and so forth. So you can't overlook, right, the compassion owed to some, because you do in fact feel compassion for these.
Okay. Can you address all this question about the Church of America in general?
Oh yeah, of course it has. I think we all just, of course it has affected, it has permeated. Our kids, Catholic kids are just like everybody else, watching the same TV shows, listening to the same music. I have to listen to it too, because my kids listen to it, and it's really awful, some of it. And so, they're in this culture too. So of course, to the extent that and the media tends to, of course, take that point of view. There are so few forces resisting that, and so many promoting it. So of course they're influenced by it, and we all are ourselves influenced. We have to fight it, right? We have to consciously oppose those things and reflect on them.
And a final question.
Hi, Professor Garcia. When you survey the three atheistic attempts to provide an ethical theory, I think obviously you're right, these are bad attempts attempts. I didn't see an argument in there that the specific downfall of those 3 attempts was their atheism. I'm not sure if that's the point where the problem enters in. They all have all these problems. And I think we have a lot to learn from some atheist ethicists, too. They're not all outrageously immoral in that way that some of these answers we cited suggested. I wonder about the alternative suggestion that we need a metaphysical starting point with a robust metaphysical person, because I think that we have very serious ethical obligations to the animals who may not have immaterial souls or agent causality in the same way we do. So I guess I'm thinking that maybe it's more complicated than your overall outline suggests.
Yeah, that's fair. I didn't mean to say either things that might be taken to be saying. One would be that atheists never have any important contributions to moral reasoning or never have anything to offer there on the reflection of moral principles, which moral principles to adopt, or that in the case of the 3 people I do consider that all of their, what I consider to be their pernicious views are a direct result of their atheism. I do think that often they're a direct result of their naturalism, maybe their materialist view of the person, that it's very hard to find, as we're all familiar, a place for values, as it were, or worth, or whatever, inherent dignity in a world which is strictly describable in empiricist terms, right? So Nielsen, for instance, used to be a very big fan of logical positivism and that criterion of meaningfulness and so forth. So I think he still has a nostalgia for that. The good old days, as it were, when you could just declare all this stuff simply meaningless. Now you have to say something about it. But I think it's more their view of the human person that's inadequate. And in order to retain a good view, a true view, in my view, of the human person, it's not as though you have to also, along the way, defend the existence of God. But I think the two are more closely linked than we might want to admit. That is much more difficult to defend a view of not so much the metaphysics in a way here, but the shift from the metaphysics to the questions that Professor Hogan was talking about. We shift from that to talking about, well, what is a human being? What's our goal? Is sort of what are we about? What are we striving for? And should we, given that we're things of this kind, should we sacrifice, one for the sake of the others and so forth, and why not? I think it's very hard to preserve that kind of strong sense of human rights and their inviolability and so forth without appealing at some point to God and to our being creatures of God and not having ownership over ourselves and that kind of thing. But maybe it could be done. I'd be happy if it could be done too. But I mean, truths should be defended however they can be defended, in my view. But I think in the end it might be that some appeal to God is necessary there.
Just one comment. I think perhaps this is because of my move to Portland, where you're much more involved in experiences in the environment. I think that when we come to understand ourselves as beings who exist in these various relationships, we exist in a relationship to this earth, and we need to tend it. We exist in relationship to all the beings of the earth, and we need to tend them too. So I think as we would play this out, that would come into play.
I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel.